So the purpose of this video is to just quickly go over some of the features in firmware 1.13. It's a huge update. There's a lot to explore, but I thought I'd start off by talking about some things that I'm really excited about in this firmware. And the place I'm going to begin is with the tap to CV converter. So one of the advantages of this is that you can use either CV control or tap control to control different modules within ZOIA. Before, you had to choose between CV and tap, but what the tap to CV converter does is convert tap tempo into CV. And the advantage of CV over tap tempo is that it is much more flexible to manipulation. So you can invert, CV. You can modulate the connection strength of CV. You can, sequence CV in ways that you can't sequence tap. But because you've converted the tap to CV, you have this reference point of a tapped tempo, or again, a MIDI clock or whatever. So this is a really simple patch. It's based on the rate control generator in the ZOIA Huasca patch that I released yesterday. And the idea is pretty simple. It basically creates a system where if you tap, that gets priority. And if you adjust a rate control, that gets priority. And you can go back and forth between either one. And the way that works is that there's an in switch down here. One input should go to the rate control. Sorry, I just copied this over and had to make some changes. Let me check this one too. Yeah. So one in switch input goes to this rate control, right? And it gets outputted. The other one goes from a stomp switch in to one of the new clock dividers, and I'll quickly go over that. There's a dividend and a divisor. So in the clock divider, you could set complex ratios that before required two clock dividers. And while there's still some lag for the clock divider to adjust to new tempos, before what would have to happen is the first clock divider would have to adjust to a new tempo, and the second clock divider would have to adjust to a new tempo. So anytime you wanted a complex tempo, it would involve a lot of weirdness in between. This new one works a lot better. It drifts a lot less. It uses a better rounding mechanism, so it's much more stable. All around an improvement, and the advantage again of these dividend and divisor points is that you can put in complex rhythms and they'll be recognized. So this goes into a tap to CV converter. And I want to go real quickly into the option menu for this because something was changed during beta testing that I hope will be changed back for firmware 1.14 because I think it was much clearer. There's this thing called a range control, and it's on or off. Prior to this, it was called a hertz or time control. And basically the tap to CV converter can function in a variety of ways, but the way that CV is calculated for something like an LFO is very different from the way that it's calculated for something like a delay line or an ADSR. So when the range control is off, it's functioning as a hertz calculator, like you would use for an LFO, or a modulation effect, like a chorus or, you know, whatever. So right now, this is set to hertz. I've included two versions of this. The idea is, you know, maybe you want to copy them into your ohm patches. So this would be the hertz one, and it's set to exponential right now, which is the same scale that, you know, the chorus or the flanger use. So something like this would be something that you could pop in to switch between CV control or tap tempo control. And the way that it switches back and forth between the two is that we have a sample and hold here, and it's sampled every time the stomp switch is tapped. So the stomp switch goes into the clock divider. It also goes into the sample and hold. Then the sample and hold is fed into the input, the negative and positive input of two comparators, and the rate is sent into the, you know, the converse positive and negative comparators. I've written more about this on Tips and Tricks. This is what's called an identity function. And basically what it does is when the tap tempo is set, both of these comparators will go high because the input and the output, the positive and negative inputs are the same, right? The sample and hold samples the rate at that point, and the rate, you know, goes into the other one. When we change the rate, one or the other of them will go low. And so we can switch back and forth between CV control and tap control. And then these are fed into a multiplier, and that controls which channel the switch uses. So when they're both high, it switches to channel 2. But as soon as you adjust this, it goes back to channel 1. And then you take this output and send it to, you know, an LFO set to exponential, or a, you know, flanger or whatever you'd like to. And you could switch back and forth. It automatically detects which one you're using based on the change, right? If you tap, it switches over to tap tempo. If you adjust the CV controller, it switches back to that. I did another one of these for time, and the time tap tempo or tap to CV converter is a little different. So you have to set the range for this, and that's because time is used by a variety of modules in a variety of different ways, you know, from a 100 millisecond delay line all the way up to, this goes up to 60 seconds, so that you can set tap tempo for ADSRs or CV delays or slew limiters, whatever, you know, modules go up to 60 seconds. So it covers the gamut. It also has two options between linear and exponential. Most of the modules that use time right now use exponential, but I figured the most common example would be a delay with mod. So this is set up for the range of that, which goes from 62.5 milliseconds to 2 seconds. That's the range of the delay effect modules. And I wanted to show one example of what you can do with that. So what I've done is I've placed a slew limiter here. You know, it goes from the output of this switch to the slew limiter, and then into the delay time. And what I can do is see if I can increase the mix. Sorry, I'm just increasing. So what I can do is use the slew limiter to slow down the change between two different tap tempos. But both of them are tap tempos, so you could, change between two different tap divisions. There's a lot of options there. I just wanted to put this into a patch that you could download, so if you did want to have that option of switching back and forth between CV control and tap control, you could do so easily. So that's CV and tap. The next example that I have is proportional envelopes. So the idea here is that you could set an envelope that maintains the proportion between attack and decay relative to one another. And the way that you do that is, first of all, by creating a value module and then inverting it and sending it into a value module biased to 1. I've talked about this before in a lot of other videos. What you're doing is inverting this value between the range of 0 to 1. So you invert it, and that makes it negative, and then you basically use this value module biased to 1 to add 1 to it. Now, with a linearly controlled ADSR, the ratio between the output of this value module and this value module will be maintained. So what I've done here is I've used another tap to CV converter. I've set it to range mode again, which again has to do with time, and the range here is 0.02 milliseconds to 59.9 seconds, which is the range of an ADSR, and this time it's set to linear. So I'm using the CV control of linear of the linear CV of the ADSR, which was added in 1.13. And then I've set the ADSR to loop using a comparator. So when the ADSR goes low, the comparator sends a signal back to the beginning of the ADSR, and it loops back and forth. But if we look at its output, right, we can change this because they're proportional. The ADSR has the same length, but the relationship between attack and decay changes. So now the attack is longer and the decay is shorter. We can push that to an extreme, right? So you can create a looping envelope, and you could add more stages to this as well, that maintains the relationship between attack and decay. And it's all controlled by a clock, right? Tap tempo. This could be an LFO, it could be MIDI clock, whatever, because we're basically taking this value, and because we have linear control, we can separate that value into divisions of 1. So we have, one part of that division on one side and the other part on this side. We're using multipliers here. So the output of the CV to tap goes into both of these multipliers. The value module goes into one, the other value module goes into the other, and then they control the two stages of the envelope. And as we adjust this, the total time of the envelope will stay the same, but the proportion between the two will change, which was something that wasn't possible with the exponentially controlled envelope, because the different CV values would reflect, very different points in the curve. And I just wanted to throw together an example of how this might be used musically. So I have a sequence going here, and I can change the envelope as it plays. The envelope always stays the same length. So again, it's going into, it's the same setup. As I said, you could use an LFO or a clock or whatever. We have an LFO here controlling the tap to CV converter, and then it goes through the same process, but now it controls the output of a VCA rather than being looped back on itself. And then it's just I think I used a sawtooth oscillator. So that's just an example of how the proportional envelope might be used in two different ways. One is a looping envelope, and the other as a way of affecting the sound of a sequence quickly without having to do a lot of adjustments, right? Because as I adjust the attack, the decay is proportionally adjusted as well. I'm going to turn that down for a second to talk about this example. So here we have a linearly controlled LFO. We have another tap to CV converter using tap tempo again, but this could be a MIDI clock. It could be an LFO. It could be any number of sources for providing the clock. It goes into a clock divider, which multiplies the tap tempo, right? And that goes into this goes into a clock divider. This goes into a multiplier, right? And what I'm doing here is using a 2-track sequencer. The first track goes to our synth voice up here, which is just, oscillator, BCA, that sort of thing. The second track goes into our multiplier. And again, because we're using a linear time scale, we can use specific values in the multiplier to set specific note lengths that are related to the clock. So I'm going to turn this back up again. When the step is at A10, 100%, I'm using the note values because they're quicker to dial in. We get the accurate speed of the LFO, or of the output of the clock divider, because it's 100% times the output of the tap to CV converter. So that gets fed into the LFO. But if we have a step that's at A5, that's dividing that time by half. So what we get is a note that is twice as long. We can also have notes right? D#3 comes in at a quarter of the length. So what we're really doing here is setting our quickest time and then using these divisions to set things like whole notes or half notes, you know, or you could think of it as setting a 16th note and working backward from there, because we can set with a C2, again, something easy to dial in, a division that's 1/8 of what the clock is. But again, because it's linearly controlled, when it goes to the LFO's rate, it's all proportionate, right? These are all related to the tap tempo. So A5 is 0.5, and it's half the length of the output of the tap to CV converter. Then this example uses one other facet of the update in 1.3, which is called a bug fix, but I see it as a feature update. So before, in order to use the retrigger input of an ADSR, you had to use a separate gate source. If a gate was received at the same time as the retrigger input would be ignored, which made it very difficult to use because we don't normally think of those as coming from different sources. So now you can use the same gate source to retrigger the envelope and start it back at its attack phase. If I remove this connection to the retrigger, right, we basically get two different ways of retriggering the envelope, which both have their advantages. But having both of those options gives you some choice about how you want your envelopes to sound when they're retriggered. So that's using a sequencer track as a clock divider for the LFO that is in fact running the sequence. Again, something that really is only possible with this particular firmware. The final example I have is of the round robin MIDI feature. Now, I know some people have already thought about how to use that externally. You know, one of the problems with using the MIDI note in to control something like the digitac, which I've talked to a few people about, is that before the different note priorities would cause each note to re-trigger the sample rather than move on to the next channel of the digitac or digitac. So now the round robin allows that to happen, but there's also some really fun stuff that you can do internally. So what I've done here is I have a round robin, a 3-note input. I just tried to keep it simple. The gates go to ADSRs. These are loaded in their default, and it's just oscillator into a VCA that's controlled by that ADSR. And then they exit into a ghost verb, and the ghost verb goes to the audio out. But what happens here is that I've set each of these oscillators to a different waveform. So this is a sine, this is, if I remember correctly, a sawtooth, and this is a square wave. So as I play the same note, the round robin skips from one output to the next, to the next, to the next, and each note sounds different, even though they're the same frequency. And this is also really interesting for something like external sequencing. The controller I'm using right now is a Novation Base Station 2, which has an arpeggiator. And if I turn that on, when I play 3 notes, because there are only 3 outputs for the MIDI note in, if I play 4 notes, the oscillator skips around because it's going through 4 notes with 3 outputs. So it keeps changing the arpeggiation, which allows for some interesting opportunities for sequencing and variety. You know, and you can play notes that are composed, or chords that are composed of 3 different oscillator types. So the round robin, I think, offers a lot of fun opportunities. The other thing that I wanted to show off was the MIDI pitch bend in. And one of the advantages of having this as a separate module is that we can control how it's used. So what I've done here is I've sent it to each of the oscillators, but I've done something different with each one. I'm going to disconnect this for just a second. This one is set to 10%, which means that it will control a range of 1 octave. This one is controlled by an inverted copy of the pitch bend, which means that when this note goes up, this note, or this oscillator, will go down, which again is a nice amount of flexibility. So I can have a pitch bend where the different oscillators behave differently based on how they're connected to the pitch bend. Now you could obviously set them all up to behave in the same fashion too for classic pitch bending, but this option gives you some different opportunities. And then finally, this oscillator is connected at a 5th. So I can the other advantage of having it as a separate module is that you can send the pitch bend to other destinations. So the example I'm using here is sending the pitch bend not only to the oscillators, but also to the mix control of the ghost verb. So as I increase pitch bend, let me do that more slowly. We go to a 100% wet reverb. And if I pitch bend down, I get a dry signal. So having the pitch bend as its own module allows you to do things that are impossible with a lot of other synths, because you don't, because the pitch bend will usually be hardwired to the oscillator pitches, and it'll usually be hardwired in such a way that it behaves the same for all of the oscillators. So these are 2 ways to use the round robin to create some interesting, different synth voices. And obviously these could be the same, waveform, but given slighter differences so that it didn't sound quite as abrupt, maybe different filter frequencies or something like that. I tried to go for something extreme, but there are also subtle options that really allow you to play around with the fact that the round robin will skip from oscillator to oscillator. Right? And then again, the MIDI pitch bend allows you to do things that are just simply impossible in other circumstances. So I think both of these changes allow for a huge amount of flexibility in designing synth patches that are externally controlled or externally sequenced. Again, you know, I can use if I used a sequencer that had a number of notes that was not a multiple of 3, right? If it was an 8-note sequencer, it would also, each time it passed through its sequence, create different arrangements of oscillators and therefore allow the sound to evolve in ways that the previous MIDI note in would not allow for. So the MIDI note in is useful both for polyphonic stuff, but also for monophonic sources, because it will distribute each note to a new oscillator. So that's my little overview of some neat stuff you can do with 1.13. Again, there are a lot of other things in this update, and I haven't even touched on close to all the things that the modules and changes that I've looked at can allow you to accomplish. But I just sort of thought I'd share some of these because they're things that really inspired me creatively. And so I hope this video is helpful to you in terms of, you know, thinking of maybe some ideas that are useful, but also understanding or seeing some examples of the changes so that they're easier to think about how to use creatively. All right, so this is long at this point, but again, thank you, and I will see you again sometime. Bye.